In a quaint, picturesque town where everyone knew each other's business, Emily Carter was the talk of the season. She was the only child of Richard and Patricia Carter, a couple known for their impeccable taste, lavish parties, and high social standing. The Carters lived in a sprawling mansion at the edge of town, surrounded by manicured lawns and expensive cars that gleamed under the sun. Life had been good to them, and they took pride in their reputation as one of the most influential families in the area. Emily, however, wasn't like her parents. While she enjoyed the comforts of her privileged upbringing, she had a warmth and kindness about her that set her apart from the rest of her family. She volunteered at local shelters, loved reading poetry, and often dreamed of living a simpler life. So when she met Ethan Thompson at a community art exhibit, it felt like fate. Ethan was everything the Carters weren't: humble, down to earth, and utterly genuine. He worked as an architect and spent his weekends hiking or tinkering with old furniture he found at flea markets. Their connection was instant. They bonded over shared interests, late-night conversations, and a mutual desire to make the world a better place. For the first time, Emily felt truly understood. But when she introduced Ethan to her parents, the reaction wasn't what she'd hoped for. Richard raised an eyebrow at Ethan's casual attire, a plain shirt and jeans, and Patricia couldn't hide her disapproval when Ethan mentioned his modest upbringing. Still, Emily insisted that Ethan was the man she wanted to spend her life with, and after months of persuasion, her parents reluctantly agreed to the engagement. What the Carters didn't know, though, was that there was more to Ethan's family than met the eye. James Thompson, Ethan's father, was a quiet man who exuded humility. He wore simple clothes, drove an unassuming sit-in, and spoke softly. To the Carters, he seemed like just another working-class retiree who had spent his life doing manual labor. What they failed to realize was that James had built his fortune quietly, far away from the glitz and glamour they so desperately chased. Years ago, James had founded a successful construction company that grew into a corporate powerhouse. Under his leadership, the business expanded into real estate development, engineering projects, and even technology infrastructure. By the time he stepped down as CEO, the company was worth billions. Yet, instead of flaunting his wealth, James chose to live a low-key life, focusing on spending time with his family and giving back to the community. His decision to stay anonymous meant that very few people outside his inner circle knew the truth, including Richard Carter, who reported directly to the board of directors James still oversaw. As the wedding planning began, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Richard and Patricia saw Ethan's family as outsiders who didn't belong in their elite social circle. They criticized every detail Ethan and his parents suggested, insisting on hosting a grand affair complete with imported flowers, designer outfits, and a guest list filled with prominent figures. Meanwhile, James watched silently, observing the Carters' behavior with a mix of amusement and curiosity. He could have ended the charade right then and there, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the hope that the Carters would come around, or maybe he simply wanted to see how far their arrogance would take them. Either way, he decided to play along, knowing full well that the truth would eventually come out. And when it did, it would change everything, for better or worse. The wedding planning became a battlefield, though no one said it out loud. Emily, caught in the middle of her parents and Ethan's family, tried her best to keep the peace. She wanted the day to be perfect, not just for herself and Ethan, but also as a way to bridge the gap between their two families. But the Carters had very different ideas about what perfect meant. Patricia took charge of the preparations with military precision. She hired an expensive event planner, booked a luxurious venue overlooking the serene lake, and insisted on a color palette that matched her vision of elegance: ivory, gold, and soft blush pink. Every detail was scrutinized, right down to the font on the invitations. When Emily timidly suggested incorporating some of Ethan's favorite things into the decor, like wildflowers or rustic wooden centerpieces, Patricia dismissed the idea with a wave of her hand. "We can't have anything looking too casual," she said firmly. This is your special day, darling. It has to reflect who you are and where you come from. Ethan's mother, Margaret, tried to contribute ideas, but Patricia quickly shut her down. Margaret suggested using local vendors for the catering and flowers to support small businesses, but Patricia scoffed at the notion. Honestly, dear, she remarked with a tight smile, you wouldn't understand the kind of standards we're aiming for here. Margaret exchanged a glance with James, who sat quietly in the corner, his expression unreadable. He gave her a subtle nod, signaling her to let it go. James himself remained a mystery to everyone involved. He attended meetings reluctantly, always dressed in plain clothes that seemed almost deliberately understated compared to Richard's tailored suits. Whenever Richard brought up work during these gatherings, boasting about his latest projects or connections, James would listen politely but offer little in return. This only fueled Richard's growing disdain. He doesn't even try to engage, Richard muttered to Patricia one evening after a particularly tense meeting. It's like he thinks he's above all this. Meanwhile, Emily grew increasingly frustrated. She loved her parents deeply, but their dismissive attitude toward Ethan's family hurt her more than she cared to admit. One afternoon, while flipping through fabric swatches with her mother, she finally snapped. "Mom, why do you treat them like they don't matter?" she asked, tears welling up in her eyes. "They're good people. They raised Ethan to be the man I'm going to marry. Why can't you see that?" Patricia sighed, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, I just want what's best for you," she replied gently. "But marrying someone different comes with challenges. You need to think about how this will affect our family's reputation." Her words stung, but before Emily could respond, Ethan walked in, carrying a bouquet of daisies he picked from his garden. Seeing him, Emily's mood brightened instantly. In that moment, she realized that no amount of planning or arguing could change her mind. She loved Ethan, and nothing, not even her parents' disapproval, would stop her from spending the rest of her life with him. As the weeks went by, tensions escalated further. At one point, Patricia insisted on flying in a celebrity chef to design the menu, despite knowing it was far beyond the Thompsons' budget. James, however, surprised everyone by agreeing without hesitation. "If it makes Emily happy, then it's worth it," he said simply, pulling out his checkbook. His calm demeanor left both Richard and Patricia speechless, though neither dared to question him further. Behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate among the wedding planners and vendors. Some recognized James's name from industry circles, while others noticed the effortless authority with which he handled financial matters. Still, no one dared say anything outright. For now, the Carters remained oblivious to the truth, continuing to treat James and Margaret with thinly veiled condescension. Little did they know, their assumptions were about to collide with reality in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. As time passed, the dust settled, and life began to take on a new rhythm for everyone involved. The Carters, once so consumed by their social status and rigid expectations, found themselves transformed in ways they never anticipated. Richard threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove that he was more than just a man who had once been humbled. Patricia, too, underwent a quiet revolution within herself. She started volunteering at local charities alongside Margaret, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine camaraderie as they bonded over shared goals of helping others. Emily and Ethan's marriage flourished under the weight of everything they had endured together. They learned early on that love wasn't about avoiding challenges but facing them head-on, with trust, patience, and open communication. Their home became a sanctuary where both families could come together without judgment or pretense. Sunday dinners became a cherished tradition, filled with laughter, stories, and even moments of lighthearted teasing between Richard and James. Though it took time, Richard eventually earned back some of the respect he had lost, not through grand gestures, but through consistent effort and sincerity. James remained the steady anchor of the Thompson family, his wisdom guiding them through the ups and downs of life. He continued to live modestly, refusing to let his wealth overshadow the values he held dear: kindness, humility, and integrity. Margaret often joked that he was too stubborn to retire completely, as he still advised the company's board from behind the scenes. Yet, despite his influence, he insisted on staying out of the spotlight, preferring instead to focus on what truly mattered: his family. For Emily and Ethan, parenthood brought an unexpected joy that deepened their connection even further. A year after their wedding, they welcomed a baby girl named Lily, whose arrival brought both families closer than ever before. Richard and Patricia doted on their granddaughter, eager to make up for past mistakes by being present and supportive grandparents. James and Margaret, meanwhile, reveled in the simple pleasures of watching Lily grow, teaching her the importance of gratitude and compassion from an early age. The Carters' transformation didn't go unnoticed by those around them. Friends and neighbors marveled at how much they had changed, noting the absence of arrogance and the presence of genuine warmth. Richard, once quick to boast about his achievements, now spoke proudly of his daughter's strength and his son-in-law's character. Patricia traded her lavish parties for intimate gatherings, finding fulfillment in creating meaningful connections rather than superficial ones. Together, they embraced a simpler, more authentic way of living, one that aligned with the values they had once dismissed. Looking back, Emily often reflected on how far they had all come. What had started as a clash of egos and misunderstandings had ultimately led to growth and reconciliation. She realized that none of it would have been possible without James's quiet leadership and unwavering grace. His decision to reveal the truth hadn't been about revenge. It had been about setting boundaries, fostering understanding, and paving the way for healing. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the two families gathered at the park to celebrate Lily's first birthday, Emily watched her parents interact with Ethan's family. Richard laughed heartily at one of James's jokes, while Patricia helped Margaret arrange cupcakes on a picnic blanket. Ethan stood beside her, holding Lily securely in his arms as the golden sunlight bathed them all in its glow. "You know," Emily said softly, leaning into Ethan, "I used to think weddings were just about starting something new. But ours, it ended up changing everything. For the better." Ethan smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That's because we didn't just start a marriage that day. We started a whole new chapter for both our families." And as Lily giggled happily in her father's arms, surrounded by people who loved her deeply, it was clear that this chapter was only beginning. It was a story of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of love. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful outcomes arise from the hardest lessons. In the days following the wedding, life for both families was anything but ordinary. The revelation of James's true identity had sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone, from close friends to distant acquaintances, reeling. Whispers about the dramatic turn of events spread like wildfire, and soon the Carters found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. For Richard and Patricia, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Their carefully constructed image of wealth and influence now felt hollow, overshadowed by their own arrogance and the humiliating truth they had ignored. At first, Richard tried to downplay the incident, insisting to his colleagues and neighbors that James's announcement had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But no one was buying it. Mark Reynolds, the former executive who had recognized James at the rehearsal dinner, made sure the story got out. "You don't treat someone like James Thompson the way the Carters did," he told a group of mutual acquaintances during a casual lunch. "If anything, this should teach us all a lesson about judging people based on appearances." His words resonated deeply, and soon, public opinion began to shift against the Carters. Patricia, desperate to salvage her reputation, attempted to reach out to Margaret in private. She called her multiple times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and promises to make amends. When Margaret finally agreed to meet, Patricia arrived at the Thompsons' modest home dressed in her finest attire, clutching an expensive bouquet of flowers. To her surprise, Margaret greeted her warmly, inviting her inside without judgment. Over tea, Patricia broke down, tears streaming down her face as she confessed how ashamed she was of her behavior. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Patricia admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting Emily, ensuring she married into a family that aligned with ours. But I see now how wrong I was. Your family. You're better than we could ever hope to be." Margaret listened patiently, her expression softening as she saw the genuine remorse in Patricia's eyes. "We all make mistakes," she said gently. "What matters is what you do next. If you truly want to make things right, show us through your actions, not just your words." Meanwhile, Richard struggled to come to terms with his position. Knowing that James held ultimate authority over his career left him feeling powerless and humiliated. He considered resigning, thinking it might be the only honorable thing to do, but James intervened before he could act. Summoning Richard to his office, a sleek, modern space that contrasted sharply with his humble demeanor, James offered him a choice. "You can stay in your role," he said firmly, "but under new conditions. No more cutting corners or taking shortcuts. Earn your place here, Richard, or walk away with dignity. The choice is yours." Richard chose to stay, humbled by the opportunity to prove himself. Over time, he threw himself into his work with renewed determination, earning back some measure of respect from his peers. Slowly, he began to rebuild bridges, not just professionally, but personally as well. He started attending family dinners at Emily and Ethan's new home, bringing small gifts and heartfelt apologies each time. Though it took months, his efforts eventually softened Emily's heart, though she remained cautious, watching closely to ensure his change was genuine. For Emily and Ethan, the aftermath of the wedding tested their relationship in unexpected ways. At first, Emily wrestled with guilt, torn between loyalty to her parents and gratitude toward the Thompsons. But Ethan stood steadfast by her side, reminding her that love wasn't about choosing sides. It was about finding common ground. Together, they decided to give her parents a second chance, setting clear boundaries and expectations moving forward. As weeks turned into months, the rift between the two families began to heal. James and Margaret continued to live their quiet, unassuming lives, refusing to let their wealth define them. They welcomed the Carters' attempts at reconciliation with grace, understanding that growth often comes from discomfort. Even Richard and Patricia, stripped of their pretenses, discovered a newfound humility that brought them closer to their daughter and to each other. By the end of the year, Emily and Ethan celebrated their first anniversary surrounded by loved ones, including both sets of parents. It wasn't perfect. Old wounds still lingered beneath the surface, but there was progress, forgiveness, and hope for the future. As they raised a toast to the year ahead, Emily looked around the room, her heart swelling with gratitude. Through all the challenges, one thing was certain: love had triumphed, proving stronger than pride, misunderstanding, or fear. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, the air was thick with unease. Guests who had attended the event couldn't stop talking about Richard and Patricia's behavior, or James Thompson's calm, almost enigmatic response. While some found the Carters' comments offensive, others were intrigued by James's quiet confidence. It wasn't every day you saw someone so unfazed in the face of such blatant condescension. Among those buzzing with curiosity was Mark Reynolds, the former colleague who had approached James at the end of the evening. A retired executive himself, Mark had worked closely with James during the early years of the company. He knew firsthand how brilliant and driven James was, and how humble he remained despite his immense success. As he sipped his coffee that morning, Mark replayed their brief conversation in his mind. Something about James's demeanor, the way he carried himself with quiet authority, had struck him as odd. Why would a man of James's stature allow himself to be treated like an outsider? Mark decided to do a little digging. He discreetly reached out to a few mutual acquaintances, casually asking if they'd heard anything about James recently. To his surprise, one of them confirmed that James still held significant influence over the company, even though he no longer took an active role in its day-to-day operations. "He's not just involved," the acquaintance said cryptically. "Let's just say he pulls more strings than anyone realizes." Word spread quickly among the wedding guests. By mid-morning, hushed conversations erupted in small clusters around the venue. Some whispered about James being the founder of the very company where Richard Carter worked, while others dismissed the rumors as absurd. Surely, if James were that powerful, he wouldn't tolerate the Carters' rudeness, would he? The speculation only added to the tension hanging over the day. Meanwhile, Richard and Patricia remained oblivious. They spent the morning finalizing last-minute details for the wedding, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Patricia fussed over flower arrangements, insisting that each bouquet be rearranged 3 times until it met her exacting standards. Richard, on the other hand, paced nervously near the altar, barking orders at the staff and making unnecessary adjustments to the seating chart. Neither of them noticed the sideways glances or the subtle shifts in tone when people spoke to them. Emily and Ethan, however, sensed that something was off. When they arrived at the venue to prepare for the big day, they were greeted by awkward smiles and hesitant greetings. One guest, a distant relative of Patricia's, pulled Emily aside and asked cautiously, "Is everything okay between your family and Ethan's?" "There's a lot of talk going around." Emily frowned, confused. "What kind of talk?" she asked, but the woman shook her head, unwilling to elaborate. Eager to get to the bottom of things, Emily sought out her mother. "Mom, what's going on?" she demanded, her voice tinged with frustration. "People keep acting weird, and I don't understand why." Patricia waved her off dismissively. "Oh, darling, don't pay attention to idle gossip," she replied breezily. "You know how people love to stir up drama." But her evasive answer only deepened Emily's suspicions. Later, as James and Margaret prepared for the ceremony, James finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I suppose you've noticed the whispers," he said to Margaret, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. She nodded, her expression troubled. "Do you think we should say something?" she asked softly. James sighed, turning to face her. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't the time or place. Let them figure it out on their own. Besides, I have a feeling the truth will reveal itself soon enough." As the hours ticked by, anticipation built among the guests. Many wondered whether James would confront Richard and Patricia before the ceremony, while others speculated that he might use the occasion to publicly expose their rudeness. The Carters, blissfully unaware of the mounting drama, continued to go about their business as if nothing unusual was happening. But there was one person who couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to unfold: Ethan. Watching his father move through the crowd with quiet dignity, Ethan felt a surge of pride and a twinge of apprehension. He didn't know exactly what James had planned, but he trusted him implicitly. Whatever happened next, Ethan knew it would change everything, for better or worse. By the time the ceremony began, the atmosphere was electric with unspoken tension. Guests took their seats, exchanging furtive glances and leaning in to whisper theories to one another. The Carters stood proudly at the front, radiating confidence, while James and Margaret sat quietly in the second row, their faces masks of calm composure. The wedding ceremony itself was a breathtaking affair, held beneath an arch of cascading white roses with the serene lake shimmering in the background. The sun cast a golden glow over the venue, and soft music from the string quartet filled the air. Emily walked down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant in her flowing gown, while Ethan stood at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers. For a brief moment, all the tension and drama seemed to fade away, replaced by the pure joy of two people committing their lives to each other. But as the vows were exchanged and the rings slipped onto fingers, the undercurrent of unease lingered just below the surface. Guests clapped politely, though many were distracted, their minds still buzzing with the rumors that had circulated throughout the morning. When the newlyweds kissed to seal their union, the applause felt slightly forced, a mix of genuine celebration and nervous energy. It wasn't until the reception that things truly came to a head. After dinner, Richard rose to give his speech, glass in hand, ready to deliver what he believed would be another cleverly veiled jab at James. He scanned the room, his gaze landing briefly on James before moving to Patricia, who gave him an encouraging nod. Clearing his throat, Richard began with a broad smile. Today, we celebrate not only the love between Emily and Ethan, but also the coming together of two families, he said, echoing the words he'd used the night before. And when I say coming together, I mean bridging worlds, worlds that are, shall we say, quite different. A few polite chuckles rippled through the crowd, though most guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard pressed on, growing bolder as he spoke. Ethan's family has taught us the value of simplicity and humility, he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. James, for instance, embodies this perfectly. His quiet demeanor, his unassuming lifestyle. It's admirable. Really. Not everyone can live so modestly, especially in today's world of excess. He paused for effect, clearly expecting laughter or agreement from the audience. Instead, the room fell eerily silent. James sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Margaret reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it gently, but he didn't react. Across the room, Emily's face flushed red with embarrassment, while Ethan clenched his fists beneath the tablecloth, struggling to keep his composure. Some guests exchanged horrified looks, while others leaned forward, sensing that something big was about to happen. Finally, James stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, commanding attention without saying a word. As he rose, the entire room turned toward him, the hum of conversation dying instantly. Richard froze mid-sentence, his confident smirk faltering as James stepped into the spotlight. "Thank you, Richard," James began, his voice steady and calm, yet carrying a weight that silenced any remaining murmurs. "I appreciate your kind words, or at least what I assume were meant to be kind words." A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the room, but James didn't crack a smile. "You mentioned humility and simplicity, qualities you seem to admire, or perhaps misunderstand. Let me clarify something for you and everyone here." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before settling firmly on Richard. "I founded the company where you work," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "In fact, I own it. Every decision, every project, every promotion, it all flows through me. And yes, I've chosen to live modestly because I believe wealth shouldn't define a person. But make no mistake, my influence is very real." The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Richard's face turned pale, his glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. Patricia let out a strangled sound, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Emily and Ethan stared at James, stunned but not entirely surprised. He had always been full of quiet surprises. James raised a hand to quiet the murmuring crowd. "I didn't plan to reveal this today," he continued, his voice softer now. "But I won't stand by and let anyone belittle my family, not even someone who works for me. I hope this clears up any misconceptions you might have had." With that, he sat back down, leaving the room in stunned silence. For several long moments, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out, led by Emily and Ethan. Others joined in hesitantly, unsure whether to celebrate or retreat. Richard and Patricia sat frozen, their faces masks of humiliation, as the reality of their mistake sank in. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a joyful prelude to the wedding, a time for both families to come together and celebrate the union of Emily and Ethan. But as guests filed into the elegant banquet hall, adorned with twinkling fairy lights and pristine white tablecloths, an undercurrent of tension filled the air. The Carters had spared no expense, ensuring that every detail screamed luxury. From the crystal chandeliers hanging above to the live string quartet, playing soft melodies in the background. Yet, despite the opulence, there was an undeniable awkwardness between the two families. Richard Carter stood at the head of the room, glass in hand, ready to deliver his toast. He glanced around the room, taking note of the well-dressed guests chatting politely and laughing softly. His eyes landed on James Thompson, seated quietly at a corner table with Margaret by his side. James wore a simple navy blazer and slacks, looking entirely out of place among the sea of designer suits and gowns. Richard's lips curled into a faint smirk as he prepared to speak, already deciding that this would be the perfect opportunity to assert dominance over the man he saw as inferior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, raising his voice just enough to draw everyone's attention. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate not only the love between my beautiful daughter Emily and her fiancé Ethan, but also the joining of two families." He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "It's always fascinating how life brings people together from different walks of life. Take Ethan's wonderful father, James, for example." Richard gestured toward James, who raised his eyebrows slightly but remained composed. "I must say, James, you must be thrilled about today." Richard continued, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Your son is marrying into quite the family, a legacy of success, influence, and, dare I say, refinement. Not many get such an opportunity, so congratulations are certainly in order." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, though most guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the thinly veiled insult behind Richard's words. Patricia, seated beside Richard, decided to join in, leaning forward with a smug smile. "And might I add, James, your outfit tonight is charming," she said, her voice laced with mockery. "It's refreshing to see someone embrace simplicity, even if it does stand out a bit in a setting like this." Her comment drew a sharp intake of breath from several guests, while Emily buried her face in her hands, mortified. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening beneath the table, but he forced himself to stay calm for Emily's sake. James, however, didn't flinch. He met Patricia's gaze with a steady, almost amused expression. Setting his glass down gently, he replied in a calm, measured tone. "Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate your kind words, and don't worry. I think I'll manage to blend in just fine." His response elicited a ripple of quiet laughter from some guests, though others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to applaud his grace or cringe at the escalating tension. Margaret reached over and placed a reassuring hand on James's arm, but he gave her a slight nod, signaling that he was unfazed. Deep down, though, James felt a mixin of emotions: amusement at the Carters' audacity, irritation at their blatant disrespect, and a tinge of sadness for his son and future daughter-in-law, who deserved better than this. Still, he chose to rise above it, knowing that revealing the truth now would only make things worse. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere remained strained. Some guests tried to steer conversations toward safer topics, but the damage had been done. Whispers began to circulate, with a few attendees speculating about James's demeanor. One older woman, a retired executive, leaned over to her husband and murmured, "There's something about that man. He doesn't carry himself like someone who's intimidated by Richard Carter." Her husband shrugged, unconvinced, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. By the end of the night, Emily and Ethan retreated to a quiet corner of the venue, seeking solace from the chaos. "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never thought they'd act like this." Ethan pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Hey, don't cry," he said softly. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. What matters is that we're doing this for us, not them." Unbeknownst to the young couple, the events of the evening were far from over. As the guests departed, one man lingered near the exit, a former colleague of James who recognized him immediately. Approaching cautiously, he greeted James with a hesitant smile. "James Thompson, is that really you?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. James nodded, returning the greeting warmly. The room was still buzzing with shock as James sat back down, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the bombshell he had just dropped. Margaret reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her eyes filled with pride and quiet relief. Across the room, Emily and Ethan exchanged a glance. Emily's face flushed with a mix of emotions, while Ethan's jaw was set in a firm line, his protective instincts kicking in for both his father and his new bride. Richard and Patricia, however, looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Richard's usual confident posture had crumbled. He stood frozen at the microphone, clutching it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Patricia, seated beside him, seemed to shrink into her chair, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer gown suddenly feeling more like armor than adornment. For once, their carefully curated facade of superiority had cracked wide open. James's revelation wasn't just a personal vindication. It was a public dismantling of everything the Carters had believed about themselves and their place in the world. Guests whispered behind their hands, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding approvingly at James's composure and poise. A few even glanced at Richard and Patricia with thinly veiled pity, their earlier admiration replaced by discomfort and awkwardness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard managed to stammer, I didn't know. If I had known." His voice trailed off lamely, unable to find the right words to salvage the situation. Patricia shot him a sharp look, silently urging him to sit down before he made things worse. Defeated, Richard lowered himself back into his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Seeing the chaos unfolding, Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't how today was supposed to go," she began, addressing the room. "Today is about love, not power or status or who owns what company. It's about me and Ethan starting our life together." Her gaze shifted to her parents, her tone softening but firm. "Mom, Dad, I love you both, but your behavior has hurt people who don't deserve it. And now, because of this, we're all sitting here dealing with something that never should have happened." Her word hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Richard stared blankly at the table, his pride shattered. Emily then turned to James and Margaret, her voice breaking slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry for everything my family has said and done. You've shown nothing but kindness, and you didn't deserve any of this. Please know that Ethan and I value your support more than anything." Margaret smiled warmly, reaching out to take Emily's hand. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. "We understand that none of this reflects who you are. We're here for you and Ethan, always." James nodded in agreement, his expression softening. "What's done is done," he said, addressing the entire room. "But let's not let this overshadow what truly matters: celebrating Emily and Ethan's love. They deserve happiness, and if anyone wants to ruin that for them, they'll have to answer to me." His words drew scattered applause, and slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. People returned to their conversations, though the mood remained subdued. Waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne, and the band struck up a lively tune in an effort to lift spirits. But the damage had been done, and everyone knew it. Later, as guests mingled on the dance floor or gathered in small groups, James pulled Richard aside for a private conversation. "Listen, Richard," he said quietly, his tone devoid of malice but firm. "I could make your life very difficult if I wanted to. But I won't. At least not yet. What happens next depends on Emily and Ethan. If they want to move forward with your blessing, I'll respect that. But if they choose otherwise, I won't stop them." Richard swallowed hard, nodding weakly. "You're a better man than I am," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll see that I was wrong." James studied him for a moment before replying. "Actions speak louder than words, Richard. Show me, and them." that you mean it. As the evening wore on, Emily and Ethan found themselves surrounded by well-wishers offering condolences and congratulations in equal measure. Despite the drama, the couple clung to each other, determined not to let the day be defined by bitterness. As they shared their first dance under the twinkling lights, Emily rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, whispering, "No matter what happens, we'll get through this together." Ethan kissed the top of her head, his heart swell.